You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And welcome to another episode on the Colonial Parkway Murders. Today we are deep diving into a very interesting facet of this case, one that has certainly kept us up many a night with questions.
And a fair number of our listeners have asked a lot of questions about this topic.
Yes. So we are going to go ahead and do a deep dive into Liberty Security and its connections to several of the victims. We would like to state up front that we are in no way, shape, or form accusing anyone involved with Liberty Security of any involvement whatsoever in the Colonial Parkway murders. Neither are we implying it, and you should not infer it. We are simply presenting the fact that we are aware of with regard to Liberty Security and its operations and the people who operated within its orbit. Have I managed to word that well enough?
Fair enough.
Are there any loopholes in there that I may need to close before we continue?
I like the use of the word orbit, since space is the final frontier and all.
Well, it really does feel like at a certain point when you look at all of the different victims in the Colonial Parkway murders and Colonial Parkway murders adjacent victims, it does seem like they all do kind of orbit around one particular person or individual or entity, however you want to word this. That is we want to call him the owner. He's not the owner.
Well, we'll get into it.
Okay, we'll get into it. Okay. And that is the person who for a short time was self-styled president of Liberty Security. And that is a gentleman by the name of Ronald John Little. Let's dig in here to the bio on Ronald John Little, first of all. Ron Little was a citizen of Auckland, New Zealand, who applied for an entry visa into the U.S. in 1985. And when he arrived in the U.S., he started out in California, but eventually moved here to Virginia. Ron Little had 2 wives in the United States, 1 child in the U.S., and 1 child in New Zealand. Ron Little was involved in various aspects of the running of Liberty Security. His business card, which we have obtained a copy of, lists him as being a private investigator, lists him as being a private security consultant, and as I mentioned before, he does list himself as president of the company.
Liberty Security was actually a pre-existing security company owned by a man named Jon Knight Hawthorne. That's Jonknight. Hawthorne is Hawthorne. I realize that all 3 of his names can be spelled multiple ways.
Yeah.
Jon Knight Hawthorne was a former deputy sheriff for Gloucester County, Virginia, who then launched Liberty Security as a private security company, primarily focused on providing security services to retail stores. The Ames department store was a client. Mm-hmm. Some of the Little Sue's convenience stores, which is sort of like a Virginia version of 7-Eleven. Is that fair?
Yep, that's about a fair assessment, yeah.
And other retail stores. So they hired private security guards and provided security and loss prevention services to these retail establishments. Jon Knight Hawthorne entered into some sort of agreement with Ron Little, who was then working for Liberty Security, for Little to purchase the company from Hawthorne. We have received new information in the last few months that this sale of Liberty Security, which was then renamed Advanced Security, was a straw man sale, so that there was actually probably no purchase made, but this was designed through some sort of agreement between Hawthorne and Little to put Little out front as the owner of the company, although it appears that Jon Hawthorne retained a silent partnership in Liberty Security.
There are connections to several of the Colonial Parkway Murders victims and Colonial Parkway Murders adjacent victims. There are connections, which I'm going to get you to talk about in a second here, Bill, to Laurie Ann Powell, to Brian Pettinger, to Robin Edwards, to Keith Call, and to Cassandra Haley. Do you want to get a little more into detail about those connections?
Laurie Ann Powell and Brian Pettinger, both of whom were murdered in late 1987, early 1988, and whose murders actually bracket the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley, as we've talked about. Laurie Ann Powell worked as a secretary and did some bookkeeping, light bookkeeping, for Liberty Security. Her parents feel very strongly that her murder is directly linked to her professional work at Liberty Security. Brian Pettinger was another murder victim who also worked at Liberty Security, and Brian Pettinger worked as a security guard for Liberty at the time of his murder. Less directly connected, but nonetheless worth noting, Robin Edwards, one of the Colonial Parkway Murders victims, has an indirect connection to Liberty Security in that Bonnie Edwards, her mom, worked in the office of Liberty Security. And then finally, and this one's a bit more tenuous, I think, Cassandra Haley's sister, Terry Haley, whom we interviewed just a couple of weeks ago, and we speak to frequently, Terry Haley had dated a former Gloucester County sheriff who did some moonlighting for Liberty Security. So it's possible that Terry Haley's brief dating relationship with this guy might have resulted in him meeting or seeing Sandy, her younger sister. So it's less of a direct connection, but it's worth noting nonetheless. So there we have the murder of 4 different individuals, and actually a total of 6 people when you consider Robin Edwards and David Knobling, and Keith Call and Cassandra Haley missing and presumed murdered. That's 4 homicides, 2 of them double homicides. It is mighty strange that this number of people have a connection, directly or indirectly, to a relatively small security company. We have unconfirmed reports recently that Liberty Security may have been trying to recruit Keith Call. Now, his family has no recollection of this, so we're not certain about this, but we have heard unconfirmed reports that Liberty Security may have been trying to recruit Keith Call to come to work for them as a part-time or full-time security guard. Now, Keith was a college student, but he was also a young, athletic guy in great shape, and he's the sort of person, like Brian Pettinger, that they were looking for to work as security guards, full-time or part-time, for Liberty Security and their retail clients.
If it sounds like too much of a coincidence that this relatively small, as you mentioned, security company would have links to 4, possibly 6 potential murder victims, you certainly are not the only person who has thought that. The thread of connectivity between Liberty Security and the Colonial Parkway Murders victims, that is definitely something that has been brought up again and again and again over the years. Interestingly enough, though, the story of Ron Little and Liberty Security just gets weirder and weirder the longer that you look at it. The weirdness aspect of it actually comes into play in 1988 when Ron Little was arrested by the INS and was about to be deported to New Zealand. Now, we know that Ron Little is not the most stand-up guy in the world. Bill's kind of nodding and shaking his head like...
You can say that again.
Yeah. The quote from some of the reporting on the Daily Press is particularly interesting here. According to Daily Press reporter Stephanie Sharp, who interviewed William Bittner, the INS agent for Southeast Virginia, he is quoted as saying that Ron Little has a rap sheet in New Zealand as long as my arm. And that is everything from counts of burglary to potential drug possession to grand theft auto. Apparently, for a while, Ron Little in New Zealand stated that he was a repo man and would, quote, go around and repossess cars that creditors said people owed money on. But most of the people were able to prove legal ownership, and in any country, that's grand theft auto. So that is from the Daily Press article with regard to Ron Little and his rap sheet.
Now, if Little had filled out his paperwork honestly in 1985 when he first came to the United States, he would have never been permitted entry into the United States because he was a convicted felon with multiple entries on his rap sheet, and he would not have been permitted to enter the United States and get work papers, not to mention later working for and then supposedly purchasing a security company and being allowed gun permits and that kind of thing for his quote-unquote private security work. So if Little had been honest with the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service here in the United States, he would have never been permitted entry into the U.S.
Again, according to this reporting, which we will post links to in our show notes, the INS actually filed 20 different felony charges against Ron Little in May of 1989, including filing false statements in order to buy firearms.
What I'm a bit baffled by is if they filed 20 different felony charges against Ron Little, why were they in such a hurry to deport him? That's the part that I've always been somewhat baffled about. Now, ultimately, Little is deported in August 1989, which, by the way, if you look at your calendar, that's before the Phelps-Lauer murder, incident number 4 in the Colonial Parkway murders, which precludes Ron Little having any involvement in the Phelps-Lauer murder. But as Kristin, you said at the top of this podcast, we are not implying that Ron Little is directly involved in any of these cases. We're just exploring this curious series of connections between Liberty and Advanced Security and the incidents that we refer to as the Colonial Parkway murders.
And now here's where things actually get even weirder, because as deportation proceedings were underway for Ron Little did something rather curious. And I'm going to again quote from the Daily Press article here because really they've said it a whole lot better than I can. Ron Little launched a media blitz of sorts, proclaiming that the FBI was harassing him about the 6 cases. And we mean the cases we've been talking about here in the Colonial Parkway murders. He sent a 6-page letter filled with accusations to dozens of newspapers, talk show hosts, television news stations, and a few senators. And you and I were just looking at the list on that the other day. And some of those are shows that I'm sure very few of our listeners will have been familiar with unless they were born in the 80s and 90s. Sally Jesse Raphael, anyone?
Yeah, it's very much an Oprah Winfrey and other.
We know Oprah. Oprah's lasted.
Sure.
I don't know where Sally Jesse disappeared to.
I'm not sure either.
She was a staple of my childhood. I'm just saying. The list was extensive, and he just went on a full-out media blitz, basically stating, hey, the FBI is harassing me about these cases. And Bill, what was the FBI's response to that?
Well, the FBI basically said that the only person that's accusing Ron Little of being involved in the Colonial Parkway murders and these other cases is Ron Little himself. So the FBI just flat out rejected the idea that he was a suspect in the Colonial Parkway murders.
We do have a quote. The FBI special agent in charge, Jim Waters, said, I don't even want to justify that man's accusation with this statement. The FBI has interrogated hundreds of people in connection with these cases. The only one pointing a finger at Little is a Little himself, and he seems to be doing it in a big way. Well said, Agent Waters.
At the same time, we bring some of these facts up because Little has outed himself publicly.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't be offering this information if he hadn't put himself out there as a suspect. He also behaved very strangely regarding the murder of Brian Pettinger as well. As family members of Brian Pettinger have told us, Little announced that he was going to provide pro bono investigative services into the murder of Brian Pettinger. And yet his behavior towards Pettinger's family was extremely odd and probably inappropriate. And without getting into too much detail, we've spoken with members of his family directly, and they have less than stellar things to say about Ron Little and Ron Little's involvement in any search for answers in Brian Pettinger's still unsolved murder.
We're not going to read the full text of the letter here. We could be persuaded to do a bonus episode with a dramatic reading. I actually wouldn't mind that too terribly much. But it is a 7-page, I guess, ramble.
Rant?
Is probably a good way to put it. Rant, diatribe, screed. Pardon the English teacher here.
He does go
getting on the synonym bandwagon. But yeah, I mean, when it gets to about page 6, you have a hard time with punctuation because there isn't any. You can definitely sense his frustration building up. It is.
We do promise, the letter is so entertaining, though, we do promise to put up a copy of the letter in the show notes and on our websites because it's totally worth reading. One word of warning, there are no paragraphs.
There are no paragraphs. No, it's 7 pages with no indentation at all.
It just goes.
It is. It definitely reads, and Bill, you can correct me if you think I'm wrong on this one. It definitely reads like a man with persecution mania almost. Like he's really laying out there that he has been harassed and bullied and vilified by all of these government agencies, INS, FBI. I think he said ATF in there somewhere, although I'm not sure where that came about.
Yeah, the ATF is mentioned in the beginning of the letter, but then they never figure in any of the narrative.
Never again, yeah.
But it's okay, Ron. You covered a lot of other ground in your 7 pages of ramble.
It definitely reads like someone who feels like he's being persecuted, and I don't know. It's one of the odder letters that I have read. Bill, what were your thoughts the first time that you read it? And keep in mind, Bill and I read all this material together, and we reread it before the show started, and there was a lot of groaning and rolling of eyes. And
well, I'd forgotten just how long, and it's kind of like there are some periods in there, but except for a few periods, it's just kind of this long run-on sentence almost. And I hadn't read it in a while, and I was just so floored that click from one page to the next, and it just goes on and on and on. And of course, he glosses over a lot of his own transgressions regarding not being truthful with the Immigration and Naturalization Service, not responding to questions in a straightforward manner, et cetera, et cetera. And yet at the same time, he just goes on and on and on. It's fascinating on some level. I do encourage consumption of your favorite caffeinated beverage before you start because you're going to need to gut it out to make it through 7 pages of text. You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after these messages. One of the most frequent questions we're asked here at Mind Over Murder is, how can I help?
Thanks to Othram, a leading forensic DNA testing lab for law enforcement, you can get involved and help solve real cases.
If you have tested at a consumer genetics company, you can contribute your data to DNAsolves.com. The process is easy and confidential. Just 2 simple steps. Your DNA might be the missing piece that helps solve the identity of an unknown person.
Then Mind Over Murder will highlight cases Othram is working on to seek your crowdfunding support for DNA testing to help solve these cold cases.
Upload your DNA profile to DNAsolves.com. It's easy, free, and confidential.
Then join Mind Over Murder as we help families find answers with Othram and DNAsolves.com.
Welcome back to Mind Over Murder.
It was the two of us sat, and just kind of worked through for about 20 minutes. And it was a lot of, I'm on page 3. Where are you? Just finished page 4. Oh my God, does this ever end?
Will this ever end?
Does this letter ever end? It is very interesting to get a glimpse of the mind of someone who legitimately feels like he was being massively harassed and persecuted. It's like, you did this to yourself, Mr. Little. You're the one who outed yourself to the press publicly. The FBI has said you have never been a suspect. They have never considered you a suspect. I'm very interested in why someone would decide, you know what, I'm going to make my life harder for myself. I'm going to make my life as hard as possible for myself by doing this.
And he then went on to do interviews with radio, television, and newspapers. This is a pre-internet environment. And continued to accuse the FBI and the INS of railroading him. By the way, I'm not saying that the INS and the FBI treated Ron Little with kid gloves, probably far from it. But I think they were extremely unhappy with being lied to and his falsifications and him making, these odd claims about being Brian Pettinger's hero. And he specifically mentions that he is a suspect in Lorianne Powell, Brian Pettinger, Robin Edwards, David Nobling's murders, as well as the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley.
And I did take a couple of minutes when we thought about doing this episode, and we figured we've been sort of kicking around, do we do an episode about this security company? Did we not? And ultimately we decided, yes, we have to, because it is so much a part of the case. But when I had a chance to get in touch with one of our very favorite people, Jim Fitzgerald, profiler to the stars, and I asked him, what is up with people who insert themselves into an investigation? He was good enough to take a couple of minutes and write out a not insignificant response to that. I'd like to share some of Fitz's response because I think it's very instructive for everybody. So we did ask Fitz specifically not only about this person, but also a second person who injected themselves into the investigation and outed themselves to the press in pretty much the same way 20 years later, was it not?
Would that be Fred Atwell?
That would be Fred Atwell. Imagine, what are the odds of two people outing themselves publicly as suspects in a major high-profile case when it actually turns out that probably no, they weren't suspects? Who would do that? So let me go ahead and give you a little bit of insight here, and this is from Jim Fitzgerald, former FBI profiler. This is really not all that unusual. In many cases, which are high profile, people like this will contact authorities with ostensibly reliable info regarding the case, which then turns into nothing. Once their white knight status fades, they decide to turn the tables and suggest that the same authorities now consider them persons of interest, which it seems they never were. We both know real violent offenders sometimes do contact the police about their crimes just to find out what's going on in the investigation. It's a way to protect themselves and secure their own personal safety from arrest and the ability to carry out crimes. However, usually it is people with some diagnosable mental health disorder who take it to the next level. When they're not actually involved in anything to do with the case, they see themselves as meaningless once again. Then they decide to further insert themselves into the case, even if it means telling the media they're being harassed, persecuted, etc. by the same police they're trying to help. Sometimes they even eventually confess to the crime itself. That has been known to happen more than once in high-profile cases. I'd need more specific info about these two people and what they said and did at the time, but it does seem like they're both walking that thin line between reality and fantasy, mixed in with wanting to somehow be made purposeful in their respective lives. I think it's pretty good insight there from Fitz.
Well, I feel like Jim Fitzgerald's observations, I was listening to you read his letter, I feel like they fit both Ron Little and the late Fred Atwell. And
I think so.
I've always found it very striking that here we have Ron Little in 1988, 1989, in that time frame, outing himself as a potential suspect in the Colonial Parkway murders and saying he's being harassed and so on. And then 20 years later, Fred Atwell running a remarkably similar play. He went to the media and he said he was being persecuted by the FBI and that they had taken his notebooks and other materials from him, interrogated him, treated him as a suspect. I do recall that the FBI was extremely unhappy with Atwell, and they warned the families and me specifically to stay away from Atwell, that he wasn't to be trusted, and that he was potentially a suspect in the Colonial Parkway murders, which I think was valid, certainly in terms of being thorough, but I don't regard Fred Atwell as a likely suspect with any direct involvement in the Colonial Parkway murders, perhaps knowledge of the Parkway murders, and I'll continue to be frustrated with Fred to this day for dying on us before he coughed up whatever he had to say about the Colonial Parkway murders. We've talked with Joyce Call Canada and other family members about our frustration with Fred, with the endless self-aggrandizing comments and the stories. And you always thought there was a kernel of truth to some of these crazy stories, and there probably was. Interestingly, I noticed that Leo Perk, P-E-R-K, now deceased, was the attorney for Ron Little back in the late 80s, and he was also an attorney for, wait for it, Fred Atwell in the 2009 or so, 2010 timeframe.
It's hard to overlook the similarities between those two colorful characters. It is definitely one of the more interesting chapters in the history of the Colonial Parkway murders. When you look at Ron Little, Liberty Security, and the potential involvement with people in their orbit with, a number of these victims. I would be curious if this case were to be reprofiled start to finish today, how the FBI would go about classifying those interactions. I would be curious if, for example, they would still want to talk to Ron Little if they felt that he is someone who would be worth talking to, or if they would kind of look at it and go, yeah, probably not somebody we want to work with. I don't know.
One thing that's curious, and this is, I think, a good example of the lack of coordination between the federal law enforcement agencies and the state of Virginia law enforcement agencies, is that we have reports from people who were there at the time who said that the Virginia State Police were continuing to seek information about Ron Little after he'd been deported back to New Zealand. I find this very curious.
Yeah.
To this day, I have never been able to figure out why the FBI and the INS deported Little if he really was potentially involved in some of these homicides. Yes, it is mighty peculiar for someone to go to the media and send letters to Oprah and Sally Jesse Raphael and senators and congresspeople and President Bush, by the way. George Bush, the father, who was president at the time. I do think it's mighty strange, but at the same time, why were we in such a big hurry to send Little back to New Zealand if he was potentially involved in the Colonial Parkway murders or some of the other unsolved murders, specifically Brian Pettinger and Lorianne Powell?
It is an interesting question. If I were to run across him today, and by the way, we do not know where Ron Little is currently. We do think he's home in New Zealand. He did make it back to New Zealand, but we don't really have a good grasp on where he is now. I would be very interested to talk to him. I think you probably would be too. And probably one of my first questions would be, how is it that all of these people who are connected to your company, how did they mysteriously end up dead? Do you want to shed some light on that? I don't have any hope that we would ever get a true statement out of him. It seems like he's maybe not someone who has the best relationship with the truth. But
it is interesting to note regarding Little's whereabouts that although Little was deported to New Zealand in August 1989, he did leave behind a wife and young son in Gloucester, Virginia, where they still reside. And we have unconfirmed reports that he may have made his way back to the United States via Canada with the facilitation of some friends. And so there are unconfirmed reports that Ron Little may have made his way back to Virginia and maybe residing somewhere in the United States. It's also worth noting that Ron Little is not his birth name. His name is actually Ronald John Sandilands, Sandilands, if he uses his father's name. Now, he seems to be using Little, which is his mother's maiden name, as his last name. And his third wife did take the last name Little as well. But it's very curious to see this guy who seems to have multiple names and aliases and countries, living in the U.S., Canada, as well as his native New Zealand. It all seems quite curious, and he does seem to have the ability to move about the country with little or no detection. So, Ron, if you're out there, we'd love to hear from you as to Kristin's questions and many others.
Yeah. One thing that we have always found particularly interesting, and Bill and I alluded to this in our episodes with Joyce Call and Chris Call, concerning the night of that party at the University Square apartments, there were unconfirmed reports that there were people walking around the party, one of older than the college age crowd, one of whom had a very large snake with him. And again, we don't have confirmation of this. We don't know what type of snake, although when I imagine large snake, I think of like a python or a constrictor. We do have some photos that were sent to us by a helpful tipster several years ago, one of which does include Ron Little with an absolutely massive constrictor, like not just in his arms or around his neck, but like all over him. Like, I'm fine with snakes, but actually that one freaks me out a little bit. If I saw a snake that big, I would probably run. It has always been very interesting to me that we had those unconfirmed reports of the guy with the snake at the party. And then we have Ron Little, who outed himself as a person of interest, who also has not just an acquaintance with snakes, but apparently collected snakes and turtles and other types of reptiles, including a tarantula. Our tipster from a couple of years ago mentioned that he came over and showed her a tarantula one night, and that would send me running for the hills. Mm-hmm. I can handle a snake. I can't handle a spider. But it is that particular little piece of information has always been interesting to me, too, if you're trying to connect dots here, which I know a lot of us are.
I was chagrined in preparing for this podcast recording today when I launched into song the Jim Stafford classic, I Don't Like Spiders and Snakes, and Kristin gave me the I have no idea what you're talking about response. Sorry, when I was a kid, there was a novelty hit called Spiders and Snakes by Jim Stafford, and we'll include a link for sure in the show notes. It's a classic. You'll absolutely love it. Jim Stafford, Spiders and Snakes. And apparently Ron Little did share an interest in spiders, snakes, and extremely large boa constrictor type reptiles.
Yeah, that is not a snake I would have wanted to run into at any party or really just any place whatsoever. But that was an interesting little item of note that we received from one of our tipsters of several years back.
Mm-hmm. And this is with photographs of her socializing with Ron and another mutual friend. And there he is in this picture with this gigantic snake wrapped around his shoulders.
Yeah. We may put that one in the show notes too. What do you think?
Why not?
The massive snake photo. Yeah. There's certainly a number of colorful characters that inhabit the space of the Colonial Parkway Murders, but I would say that probably Ron Little and one of his associates, who we're not going to name just yet, but may get his own episode in the future. He and some of his known associates are very colorful characters that populate this 3-decade-long case.
Joyce Call Canada and I have talked with Kristin about this several times. Fred Atwell was constantly in touch with both of us in the 2009-2010 timeframe and for several years thereafter. Atwell was obsessed with Ron Little and these older men that were supposedly at the college party that Keith and Sandy attended the night they went missing. By our estimation, Little would have been about 31 years old in 1988 when Keith and Sandy went missing. So, he fits the general description age-wise and in terms of interest. I don't know how I would put this delicately. Little and other people associated with Liberty Security, the men involved, seem to share an unhealthy interest in very young or sometimes even underage girls.
Yeah.
And so the idea that Little and other people he was associated with might have shown up at a college party with pretty young women who were probably age 17 to 21 or so does not surprise terribly much.
No, not at all.
We had received new information regarding people involved with Liberty Security and their potential involvement in the Colonial Parkway murders in a fair degree of depth just a couple of months ago now. And we've passed all of that new information on to the FBI, and we will also be reaching out to the Virginia State Police as well to see if they've been able to follow up on some of these tips, because it's interesting, Kristin, the way we started this podcast, you were mentioning how certain things just kind of seem to circle back around. Mm-hmm. And this is one of those areas where you hear a lot of different information about the Colonial Parkway murders, different tips come in, people have come forward. Sometimes they go somewhere, sometimes they don't. Ultimately, it's up to law enforcement to decide whether there's something worth pursuing or not. But it's fascinating that Liberty Security seems to come up over and over and over again.
Yeah, it really does. And that may be virtue of the fact that this is still a relatively small area and people's lives overlap. When Bill and I first started talking about the case back in 2015 now? 15? Yeah, 2015. It was interesting to sort of compare notes and see how many people I was already familiar with, or, I had, my dad worked with Keith Call's father. I was teaching with someone who knew Cassandra Haley. Since then, a number of people have come up to me, both at work and outside of it, and said, oh, I knew this person. I'm familiar with this person. Have you checked this tip? Have you, looked at this? It really is just a relatively small area. So it may just be by virtue of the fact that we are in a relatively small geographic area that things just keep coming back to Liberty Security. Or it might not. It might be that there really is something to this big connection here between Liberty Security and the people involved with it. We really don't know. We are not in any way stating or implying that Ron Little has anything to do with the murders of these people. He did that himself by going to the media and outing himself. What we are interested in doing is exploring those potential connections between Liberty Security and all of the various victims of the Colonial Parkway murders. That's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. If you have questions about any of the topics brought up in today's episode, please feel free to send us a message on our social media. And if you have any information with regard to Liberty Security, Ron Little, or anyone else, please make sure that you do send that information either to the FBI or to us. If you do have any information, we do urge you to come forward. Thank you so much for listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.